All righty, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. We have quite an agenda today. I'm Kim Coble. I'm the Executive Director of the Maryland League of Conservation Voters, and I am really pleased to have you joining us today, Tuesday, for what is traditionally our Friday event, the Friday Digest. We are just about 12 hours post Sine Die. So the at midnight, the legislative session ended, and here we are at noon the next day. So we wanted to give you the most current, up-to-date information on not only bill status, but sort of what's next, what went well, what didn't. And we're going to extend this till 12:45 today so that you have a chance to get your questions answered, asked and answered. So we'll do a little summary and then open it up and put your questions in the chat. Um, in the meantime, please let us know where you're from, who you are. We like to keep track of all the friends that we have. And thanks to many of you for joining. It's great to see you on the list. So as we have prepared for today, it's been hard to know how to capture exactly how this session went, quite honestly. It's been productive. We accomplished actually a lot. And yet, I think the losses, while not as many, were probably more significant than we had anticipated. So it's a mixed bag. I don't. I'd like us to compartmentalize it because the things that went well, and we had really good environmental outcomes in a breadth of areas, a wide spectrum of issues, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And those are great, and I think we can all take a lot of pride in that, making sure that those outcomes happened. The amount of engagement that you and others took was unprecedented for us. Thousands of people took action, responded to emails, called their legislators, attended rallies, et cetera, et cetera. And that made a big difference. And that's one of the reasons that we were successful. On the loss side, there were some major losses, and those are tough to digest right now. I think we're all still trying to process those. So that's the overall take, right? And what I want to start with is there were over 3,600 bills introduced in the legislature this year. That's a lot of bills. And it's a lot of bills for us to process. It's a lot of bills for legislators to track. And it was a slow start. So we ran into some timing concerns, and bills didn't move for a while. And we were trying to get committees to consider bills or take up bills. And Rebecca has a story where she testified on a bill. They voted it out that day. I mean, that was a quick moving bill. In the end, it didn't pass. So the timing was something that we were trying to manage, but it was a tricky part of the session for sure. One of the highlights for us was early in the session when Governor Moore said that he was reallocating $90 million of SEIF money, in the Strategic Energy Investment Fund, and putting it specifically to three areas: electric school buses, which is a top priority for us, 17 million there, 23 million to advancing EV charging stations at multifamily dwelling units, which is great. And then 50 million for building electrification, which again is a huge pollution source for greenhouse gas emissions. So we were really pleased with that. Thanks to you. Thanks to our lobbyists and the work that we did, that retained itself all the way through the session. So the budget was passed with that 90 million being allocated to those three areas. Really good outcome. We acknowledge it is a drop in the bucket. We acknowledge it's a first step in finding and getting long-term sustainable funding for climate. But nonetheless, it was a step, and we want to acknowledge and we're grateful for that step. On the downside on the budget, however, was a last minute, frankly, in the dark of night kind of budget amendment that was added by the conference committee. So the budget is passed by the Senate considered the budget first, and then it went over to the House. And where they don't agree, a conference committee comes together and works out things. And an amendment came in that had not been vetted, had no public exposure. And what it said is that funds going to MDE for their AIR program are going to be withheld unless the building energy performance standard regulations are basically redone to, and consideration is made for some provisions that were in there. We disagree with this and feel very strongly that this was a bad action that the General Assembly took. We think it's a bad action for the environment. We think it's a bad action for anybody that cares about the climate, anybody that's invested and believes in the state goals. And we think it's a bad action in terms of a process, because the regulation that the amendment pertains to was a result of about a 2-year process with many opportunities, work group meetings, public comments, drafts that were reviewed. And MDE went well beyond the call of duty in terms of gaining input while they drafted up the regulations. And the opponents to these regulations went to the speaker's office, got them to listen, and they basically undercut the whole 2-year process because they didn't like the outcome. So that's a big loss for us, and we're trying to understand what next steps are on that. So that was something in the budget that did not work well. The other big hurdle that we had was on the data center bill. This is one we talked about. We spent a lot of time on this, so I won't go through that. But governor's office put a bill in pertaining to the backup generators for data centers. We took exception to it. We ended up opposing it. And then an amendment was added at the end that takes 15% of the corporate income tax that data centers will pay every year and puts it towards climate reduction actions. That amendment we feel is very strong, and that changed our position to neutral. We never have supported this bill, and we don't support the bill now. We just are in a neutral position on it. So that was one that we worked on quite a bit. And both of those actions we didn't see coming at the beginning of the session. So they weren't on our radar screens, but we made it through. Those presented some big challenges for us, but I will tell you, as the director of this organization, I'm infinitely proud of staff who went well beyond the call of duty on both of those challenges. So let me now turn to my colleagues here and we're going to just run through some of the key bills that we've mentioned throughout the session. And let me start with Kristen. So Kristen Harbison, our political director, who was at the helm all the way up to midnight last night and has kept us on course. So thank you for everything this session, Kristen.
Couldn't oh well, it's always fun.
That's
even when it's not fun, it's always fun. So
let's start with solar and start with the Brighter Tomorrow Act, which fortunately passed, right? But give me a quick overview on that and what the implications are for that.
Sure. And we talked about this Brighter Tomorrow on this webinar in the past. There was a task force that was set up last year to determine incentives that will help us reach our solar goals. We need to have 14.5% of our clean energy, of our renewable energy coming from solar by 2030, and we're nowhere close to reaching that goal. So this was a bill that identified incentives that could be given to especially smaller projects, rooftop solar projects, parking canopy projects, to help those and ground mount projects that benefit nonprofits and government industry agencies. So those things will help to incentivize and spark the solar industry to help us reach those goals. And there were a couple of bills that were added on in conference as it passed through, which basically gives us three bills in one. There was the Brighter Tomorrow Act, sponsored by Sarah Elfreth, and then that was the vehicle by which all these bills carried on. There was a bill that was, and David Fraser Hidalgo was the House sponsor for the bill. There was a bill called the Community Sided Solar Project, which again provides additional funding for low and moderate income households to have rooftop solar. Was a bill that was sponsored by Delegate Lily Chee and Senator Karen Lewis Young, that was added on to Brighter Tomorrow before it passed last night, as well as a bill called having to support expedited permitting processes in counties through technology called Solar App. This was a priority for the solar industry. It was a recommendation now the task force that also got added onto it. And that was a bill sponsored by Delegate David Fraser Hidalgo in the House. And I cannot remember who was sponsoring it in the Senate, but I'm sure whoever it was is a dynamo. And I'm just forgetting for the moment, but I'll look it up. So that's what Bill did.
And so awesome, right?
Yeah, no, it's good. It's a great bill. And two other great bills were added onto it, which makes it even better.
Right. So we got 3 for 1. That's really great. So what's next on solar though? Because there's a big missing piece, right?
Yes. So this was again a bill that focused on smaller projects. There are also challenges that come from larger projects, the ground mount projects, the utility scale projects. There were some things that were recommended by the task force that were not taken up by this bill. There were labor standards added to this bill, which was very important. Which was, comprehensive, which was also good. So there are other recommendations to task force that will need to be taken up. We need to actually look at the solar renewable energy credit market and figure out how to fix it more comprehensively. There was a short-term fix included into this bill, but we need to figure out more holistically how do we do with the energy credit, how we deal with energy credits in the state. And anybody who spends any time with me here is we talk about solar siting. Where are we putting all these projects? How are we doing it? How are we balancing all of our state goals so that because we are a little state with big goals and all of it requires land use. So how do we find that balance? And so that is, I think, always going to be the next step, and we'll see where we're going. Oh, yes, and thank you, Rich. Yes, Senator Kramer, of course, was the solar app bill sponsor in the Senate.
So just to remind folks, the state has a goal of 14.5% of our energy coming from solar. We are probably in the 3% range right now.
Right.
So
and it's ramping up till 2030. So we're not supposed to have 14.5% now. We were supposed to have 14.5% in 6 years, but we're nowhere close to even where we're supposed to be at this point.
Bingo. So thank you, Kristen. And lots more work on solar that's
Absolutely.
ahead for us for sure. Who knew? But it's a really controversial topic. Surprisingly so. So all right, thanks. Rebecca, if you can jump on here with me. Thank you. And we had another great success with Empower. So if you can give us a little overview on Empower and what it does and what the benefits are of that. And yes, let's start there.
Yeah, thanks, Kim, and thanks everybody. So Empower is the state's energy efficiency program, and there is a recommendation in the state's climate pollution reduction plan that says that the program should continue doing the excellent things it's doing. It's successful and it's providing funds for energy efficiency upgrades, weatherization, things like insulation, things like that. For both low-income households, that's a program run through the Department of Housing and Community Development. And then for other households, it's run through your utility. And we measure the success of the Empower program through energy savings. And in order to make sure that Empower is contributing to our greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals, the change in the program is to measure the success of the program through greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So it's just a change in the measurement of how we look at the program. The other big thing that bill does is make sure that Empower funds can go to switching to electric appliances rather than just more efficient gas appliances, and make sure that funding goes to what are called behind the meter upgrades. So that's in the house. Utilities can actually use Empower funds to upgrade transmission lines, make them more efficient and things like that. But most of the Empower funding, because it's a line item in our utility bills, should go to that behind the meter to directly benefit households. And then also it reinforces the low income targets that the Empower program can be doing better for low income households. And so the bill reinforces some goals that the program already has. It also changes the way that the utilities are paying for the program. And that was probably one of the more controversial parts of the bill that folks found a lot of opposition up against. But it does change. It's changed the way that the program is paid for in a way that long term is going to reduce the line item on people's bills.
Yeah, I always liked this bill because it really took the Empower program and shook the rug out, if you will, right? Like it updated it. The changes make the program much more effective. That we've learned a lot as that program has been in place. And so for the legislature to stop and say, all right, let's get these things tightened up so we can continue to have a great program. I think it's a really good accomplishment, and we should all feel very proud of that. So I mentioned earlier about the Climate Education Week, the bill that moved quickly and then stopped. So tell us a little bit about what happened there.
Yeah, so that one it was a recommendation from the Maryland Commission on Climate Change, and that bill would have required the governor to declare the first week of April Maryland Climate Education Week, which is exciting to kick off Earth Month, to give students of all ages across the state to engage in climate education activities. Maryland's Teacher of the Year is very engaged in this initiative, and actually has a recent op-ed in the Baltimore Sun, which is really good, and check it out. But unfortunately, all of that momentum, it passed the House the same day of the hearing, which is almost not unheard of, but rare. And it just never it had a hearing in the Senate, but just never came up for a vote. So it just never went anywhere in the Senate. Interestingly, it looks like the governor actually did declare for this year the first week of April, and that's in a large part due to the enthusiasm from the Maryland Department of the Environment and the Climate Commission. But this year, the Climate Commission was hosting a teach-in the first week of April, and the governor did declare the first week of April in 2024 Maryland Climate Education Week. So that was a good executive action, and we're hoping that perhaps that can happen in perpetuity, but legislation would have ensured that, and it would have been a nice opportunity for learners of all ages across the state.
Yeah, it was one that we were working with MDE on, and how can you be against an education week? But anywho, real quickly here, because we're going to talk a little bit more about this with Ramon, but environmental justice writ large had an interesting journey. That topic, the work around it, and so give us a little perspective on the advancing meaningful, substantial environmental justice actions through the legislature.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. And this one is a longer story to tell for sure. And so we'll just touch on things today and hope to engage everyone here today in ongoing work on this topic. And think what we noticed during the legislative session, the amount of times environmental justice is brought up in legislation, in hearings, there's questions about it, there's interest in it as a topic, it has increased significantly in the past several years, but really this year we saw the topic being brought up all over the place. But what we noticed is that while it was a topic that was discussed and put on the table, it wasn't there, it didn't result in meaningful impact, particularly for the communities who should be leading those conversations. When we say that, environmental justice was brought up and put on the table, the question is, who's at the table when it's being discussed? And how can we make sure that the conversations around environmental justice result in meaningful action and reductions in cumulative impacts in communities? And I think what we're seeing is this conversation, but not the impact, not the result. And that's what we're going to be working to change, is really looking at the systems that are in place that create adverse impact and how to change those systems. And I think one quick anecdote on that is that, the Federal Justice 40 initiative, to allocate 40% of funding, particularly climate funding, to communities who are overburdened, underserved, disinvested. There was a bill actually to do that systematically across programs, and that didn't go anywhere. So, really looking at how we're, again, changing the system and having that Justice 40 apply across, rather than doing it bill by bill by bill, because a bright spot is actually that there was a bill, the Comprehensive Flood Management Grant Program, to increase the funding in that program. As climate change increases, we're seeing flooding and people needing more funds to address flooding. And really importantly, that bill says that at least 40% of that money goes to projects in or directly benefiting overburdened or underserved communities. We saw actually questions about that language in a not so friendly way. And so that's still under attack. Really, that language is under attack, but that bill passed. And it's a perfect example of the application of Justice 40 and environmental justice in practice. We just want to see that applied throughout our systems and not piecemeal.
Right. Yep. That's well said. And I know the 90 million, the governor specified that 50% of it needs to go to underserved, overburdened communities. So we were really pleased about that. All right. Thank you. And up next is Marissa, who is our environmental program manager. And really, Marissa's portfolio is environment and water and land and air and other. So she really keeps quite a list of bills that she's tracking. But we had a great success this year in the water program. So tell us a little bit about Whole Watershed Act.
Yes, I'm happy to come on with all the positive things to say. Senator Sarah Eldredge and Delegate Sarah Love, who are both members of the Chesapeake Bay Commission, brought forth a bill this year called the Whole Watershed Act. And the idea behind the bill was to create a pilot program that would really implement the scientific recommendations that came out of all of the scientists that work in the Chesapeake Bay program and across the watershed, at how to really advance Chesapeake Bay restoration. They looked at what's been working, what hasn't been working, and what are the things that we could do to go further faster. And Senator Elfreth often talked about this in terms of, as someone who's been an appropriator and watched how we spend budget money, how can we think about putting these things together, efficiency and progress together in our Chesapeake Bay program efforts, so that the money we're spending is really making a difference for improving water quality and the water quality that people can benefit from. So that water quality, like within our own backyards. And luckily that bill did pass with the pilot program, and it passed with some provisions that we were really happy to see included. So the pilot program doesn't specify which watersheds, but says that it will be applied to 5 different watersheds throughout the state, and that at least 2 of them, and that's the floor, not the ceiling, at least 2 of them have to benefit our overburdened and underserved communities in the state. So really looking forward to watching that get implemented and see where that goes.
Yeah, this was a great bill, and I think it was an example of a number of bills that advanced that will improve water quality. You want to touch on the Critical Area Commission bill that
Yeah,
also
this was
passed?
another great one. And people here might know that Eric Fisher came on last year as the new head of the Critical Area Commission, and he came out of Chesapeake Bay Foundation. He worked really hard with us last year in that private capacity on Forest Conservation Act. So really great guy who understands state legislature workings as well. And the Critical Area Commission requested some changes to how the language in and how they're governed and how they do their work, and really just looking for updates that are appropriate for 2024. And those updates include provisions to look at climate and consider the climate impacts on our coastal, on the lands where water and the land and water come together. So those coastal areas that they are in charge of. And then also equity, which the wording that they got put in on equity is just really great. It's really nice to see something like that pass through the state legislature to have that sort of authority given to it. And I'm really looking forward to watching that also get implemented and see that we can put these things into government.
Yeah, that I think that was another great example of the legislature really taking the long view on these programs and trying to build them so they work really effectively. So we're really pleased on that. And then anything that you want to point out that maybe didn't make it across or that
Oh, we were going to keep this all positive.
okay.
No, there were a few things. So, we had some really big wins on water. We got the Whole Watershed Act passed. Also, the Clean Water Justice Act passed this year, and that really shored up some of the protections that were taken away when the Supreme Court made their decision that narrowed the waters of the United States and what waters were protected last year in that Sackett decision. This bill, the Clean Water Justice Act, was finding a way to provide those that access to the courts in the state courts that had been taken away on the federal level, and still protect those particular waters that in Maryland we still consider important waterways for protecting. And this just sort of provided a path for that in our state. So that was a really hopeful bill, especially because it passed in its first year of being offered, and we think it may end up being a model across the country for how to sort of provide these protections for these waters that were taken away on the federal level. And so there were some great water bills that passed, but we did fall short in a couple areas. There was another bill that Senator Elfreth had on how to stack best management practices on agricultural lands and allowing more of those to go into place at once. And that didn't move forward. And similarly, nothing was done this year on septics. And septics are, nobody ever wants to talk about the septic fields. It's not a sexy topic, but something that we are really going to have to address in the watershed if we're going to address nutrient pollution across the watershed. And then the last one that sort of moved with fits and starts and looked like maybe it was going to go through this year, and then it didn't. There was a bill to try to start to get a handle on our road salt application. And that again didn't end up passing in the end. So still something that we're going to need to look at in the future.
Thank you, Marissa. The real quickly too, there were some bills that were bad bills that would have really hurt the oyster restoration efforts, and those were defeated. So that was a success in not having a bill move forward. And then last, but of course not least, is Ramon, who is been bird dogging our transportation issues and bills. And so, yeah. So Ramon, give us an overview on how the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Maryland is transportation, and how we did legislatively to beat that back.
Thank you, Kim. Yeah, well, mixed reviews there, right? There are a few important bills that unfortunately didn't make it across the finish line. One of them is the Climate Pollution Reduction Fund Act. This bill is, again, we have the last year in December, the Department of the Environment put forward the climate plan. This climate plan is to meet the goals of the Climate Solutions Now Act, and we need to raise funds to implement the plan. And we need to raise funds to implement the plan. And this is one of the recommendations on that plan, to raise funds from the import of fossil fuels, coal and gas. And unfortunately, this bill didn't make it across the finish line. The finish line, it would have been a great source of funding for to implement the climate plan, but it did not make it across the finish line. It would impose a fee on the import of gas and coal. But yeah, it stayed
And
there.
I think it was a fee on the transport of gas and
Transport.
coal.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry, transport.
Yeah.
So that was one of the transportation bills that unfortunately didn't make it. Another one that we were also supporting and work on it is the Transportation and Climate Alignment Act. You know, for new highway span, and again, it comes from the climate plan, reducing vehicle miles traveled, VMTs. And what this bill would do is, for new highway expansion projects, it would measure the VMTs, the vehicle mile travels, that increment in carbon emissions, and also implement mitigation actions to make up for that increase in carbon emissions. That's an important bill to reduce climate pollution from the largest source of emissions in the state, and unfortunately didn't make it across the finish line. It got almost there, but it just happened to run out of time in the last hours of the legislative session.
Yeah. What about the electric vehicles and registration fees and
Yeah, also a miss back there, but there's one important bill that we were tracking, we were supporting, and it did pass. And that was a bill, you know, charging infrastructure is key. It's very important to expand adoption of electric vehicles. And that was a bill that it would remove barriers to expanding charging infrastructure in condominiums, cooperatives, HOAs. So that bill did make it across the finish line. So again, removing barriers and streamlining the process of adopting, installing charging infrastructure. So that was a good one. That was a good bill that really passed.
good. All right. And of course, we got the 17 million for electric school buses, which is pretty exciting, right?
Yeah, that is pretty exciting. And again, it adds up to what we already accomplished last year. And now that you mentioned electric school buses, let me just bring up another bill. So, and a little bit of background, in 2019, we spearheaded, along with the students and along with community members, the creation of a grant program to support school districts to transition from diesel to electric school buses, benefiting the health of students, communities that host those bus depots, that school buses come in and out few times, a number of buses throughout the day. So we created that program. And last year it was, you know, the General Assembly committed $3 million. Now we see the $17 million, very important funding to transition to zero emissions and benefit, you know, the health of students. Now that as we are seeing that the pot of money increasing, we saw some efforts to include propane buses within the zero emission clean the school bus program. So that was it was very important for us to ensure that that bill didn't move, and it sure didn't move. So we are very happy to see that electric school buses are clean, zero emissions, and we need to keep it that way.
Awesome. All right. I'm going to invite our colleagues on here, and we're going to start going through your questions. So if you have them, put them in the chat and we'll pick them up. And I apologize, I got a bit of a cold here. Let's see. We're gonna start with and I'm gonna ask each of you to keep it relatively short because we want to get through these. Yeah, the RPS, right? So we have the renewable portfolio standard and tier one are clean, non-polluting sources of energy, ideally. But we also have waste incineration, the burning of trash as defined as a tier one. For the seventh year in a row, there was legislation put in to change that definition. The incinerators can continue to operate, but the state wouldn't be subsidizing those. However, the bill didn't make it through. So who wants to tackle why that happened and what we're doing next?
Yeah, thanks, Kim. I'll take it if anyone wants to jump in after me. But I think that's a great, it's a really critical topic to ask about, and noteworthy that it didn't move. We sort of thought going into the legislative session that because it's actually a specific recommendation in the climate pollution reduction plan to take waste, municipal waste incineration out of the RPS, and it was a unanimous vote from the Climate Commission, and these are things that haven't happened before. And so when people ask us going into session, like, well, it's the seventh year in a row, what's different? Well, it's different. It's a new administration. We have, a new administration who's committed to 100% clean energy by 2035. And we have these unanimous recommendations. So that's what's different. And, it's a community, the communities who are disproportionately affected by air pollution are asking for this. So it's another example of where if we're talking about listening to community voices and prioritizing environmental justice, here's one that could pass. And it didn't move. It didn't move out of either committee. Didn't even come up for a vote in either chamber. There's a lot of finger pointing. So if you ask me why it didn't pass, that one's a little murkier. I could tell you what was different and why it should have passed and all the good reasons, but there's a little murkier about why it didn't pass. There's a little game of chicken going on between the two chambers. There was a little bit of well, maybe Baltimore City, it's unclear what they want with the incinerator there. But you make the critical point, which is Maryland dollars are going to pay for trash incineration that's happening, by the way, in Virginia. So Maryland money is currently going to Virginia to support this industry. And the one in Montgomery County supports the bill. The Montgomery County government runs that incinerator. So the big one in question is the one in Baltimore, which is why there's some questions there. But yeah, it's a great question. And I think Kristen also mentioned the work to still be done on solar. We have the RPS, this question of trash incineration. And so when we think about what's next and building a campaign around 100% clean energy, I think that's where a lot of this work is going to land and what you're going to be hearing from us about pretty soon.
Yeah. So one of the questions we got is, I love this question, Kristen, why is solar controversial?
Oh, goodness. Well, I think I saw that question and yeah, I think that if you were to ask people, do you want solar energy? And everybody says, no, we love solar. Solar's clean, solar's good, solar's renewable. So solar itself is not controversial. Where the controversy comes is in terms of, again, where we put this. So we have, it's energy policy that has determined these goals, but where we put it is where it intersects with land use policy. So it's a question of like how are we prioritizing what we use our limited land for? It's about placement of it. It intersects with issues of protecting our agricultural community, our agricultural economy. Like how can we have solar and agriculture work together compatibly? And they absolutely are not. It's absolutely not a zero-sum game between them. They can exist, they can cohabitate, but it's a problem of as much, if all this pressure is on land that is currently in agricultural use, how is that going to affect our quality of life? How is this going to affect the character of the communities that are surrounding it? And so these are the questions. So these have become the fundamental question of, you know, what do our communities look like? What do they value? What do we, and you know, there's accusations of, oh well, it's just NIMBY, or oh, it's just people are scared of change. And I don't think that's true. I think it's coming to more fundamental issue of where people live and what the quality of that space is. And I think that we have to recognize that there are a lot of different perspectives about what we want the community to look like. Everybody wants it on rooftops and parking canopies, but that's not going to get us there. So how do we balance all of our state goals for water quality, for land use, for agricultural economy, for forests, all in one place? Because again, as I've said, we're a small state with big goals.
So, and the other complexity to this thing is that traditionally land use has been managed by the local governments, and yet we have this statewide goal. And so those are not the goals, and the decision-making processes are in conflict as well.
And not all
all
land is equal. And so we have it. Some counties feel like they are being overly burdened with all the energies having to go to one county over another. And so those are the kinds of fights we're having.
So let me move to the two BEPS questions, or three, real quickly here. The question about whether or not the amendment is constitutionally provided or allowed. And what does it have? Yeah, Montgomery County, and then data centers. Okay, so the first question, we're looking into that. I am not a lawyer. Actually, we don't have a lawyer on staff, so we are seeking the input of our really smart colleagues that are lawyers around this, and trying to figure out, is it legal? What's happened is the legislature in the Climate Solutions Now Act said you need to develop building energy performance standards by such and such a date, and it needs to include this provision called EUI, electric use index.
Energy use intensity.
That's it. Energy use intensity. Thank you, Rebecca. And what the amendment does is say you can't move forward with EUI. And so this leaves the agency saying, well, but you guys required us in this law to do one thing, but this budget language, which never had any public vetting at all, says to do this. And so this is going to need some legal interpretation, and yeah, and it's really unfortunate that we're also concerned about the precedent that's getting set through this process, because a budget amendment that was decided by a couple people in a corner conference room is overturning a statewide piece of legislation that had a lot of public vetting, and that's not a good look. I don't know, what effect will this have on Montgomery County's regulations? I don't know the answer to that. Does anybody else?
I think that that's an open question. And I think it's one of the things that we're going to be looking at as we're trying to figure out what is the impact of this and what our next steps are when we're looking at how we move forward from here.
Okay. So the data center is an interesting, so the other problem with this amendment is you don't know where it came from, right? You don't know that it showed up, and we can speculate about who's behind it, but the building and the BEPS regs pertain to buildings that are 35,000 square feet or greater. So yes, those would pertain to data centers. Now, were they part of the opposition to it? We don't know. We are assuming the builders and their lobbyists are opposed to it because they've been opposed to it from the get-go. So they didn't win in the public process, so they won in the corner conference room, we're presuming. Don't know about the data centers. All right, let me move quickly to, oh my gosh, it's 12:45. Marissa, water bill question. Do we need better guardrails for special interests and PACs for the water bills that did not pass. So kind of the power of influence there.
Good question. Maybe, but I think one of the things that we just started working on this year, differently than previous years that I've been engaged, is we had a much stronger and more a coalition of groups working together in a way that we have not previously. And I think first we should move forward with that. I think that's a really good model, and we were all happy with it. And we've all committed to try to work together on some of those things that we didn't see pass this year, and move forward that way.
Okay. And Ramon, let me ask you a question that looking at the next step on environmental justice in Maryland, and as Rebecca said, we've had a lot of conversation and now we need actions. What do you think the key steps are between now and next session?
Thank you. Well, I think it's very important, you know, and Rebecca, as Rebecca was saying, that how do we get communities the essence of procedural justice, right? We are very used to having those bills develop, introduce, and then the community has not been part of the process to lead to that, to a bill. So we need to ensure that, you know, we change that ecosystem, that communities are part of the discussions, communities are part of the solutions. And again, it's not always a bill that will resolve a problem in an overburdened and underserved community, but there's a set of actions that can be taken. Legislation is just one of them. So it's very important to have community supported and engaged, creating the capacity on the ground so communities are engaged. And that is one of the things, for instance, that we are doing through our CHISPA program, how to create that leadership in the Latino community, how we ensure that they have a strong voice from the onset to engage legislators on, you know, the solutions that they want to see through, not just legislation, but a number of them. So I think that that procedural justice is very important, as well as the distributed justice. And that's part of the Justice 40 comes into play, ensuring that those overburdened and underserved communities do receive the bulk of the benefits of any of these bills, programs. I think that that's also very important. So creating those coalitions, supporting the communities, I think is very important, and something that moving forward, again, we are going to continue committed to doing so and engaging other organizations in doing so.
Awesome. So last question real quickly is the bridge and any implications that had to our legislative agenda, funding and whatnot. We did not see any direct impact. Bills moved forward, the budgets moved forward. And so the only additional, you know, there was the rainy day fund allocation and funding to help the workers at the port, but it didn't have an implication to our work. So we supported all of that. Of course, it's a disaster that is heartbreaking, but we're pleased to see that things move forward. So we are at the end of our Tuesday/Friday digest of this week. We're not going to see you on Friday because we're going to take a little downtime for those folks on the screen here, well-deserved downtime. But we will be in touch. We're going to take a little bit of downtime and then we're back at it. And if we have learned one thing, is that we have to start now for next year. So keep us posted on what you're interested in hearing about. There's a survey at the end. Please let us know any information you need, anything we can do in the off session to help equip you to be a strong advocate. And let me also, on behalf of the whole organization, thank each and every one of you for being true partners. The difference you make is hard to put into words, but you truly do make a difference. And we can't do it without you. In fact, we wouldn't do it without you. We need you. So please stay engaged, stay inspired. Let us know how we can help, and we'll let you know how you can help us. And the best to all of you. Thank you for your support. Bye now.